The colony of Kepler-9 had 391 residents. The rescue fleet hanging frozen in the sky above them had 12,000. Marshal Eli Cain learned this on his second day, when an old colony schoolteacher quietly explained why no one on Kepler-9 ever closed their curtains, ever turned their backs to the sky, ever raised their voices in anger. "They can see us, Marshal," she said. "All 12,000 of them. They have been watching us for 80 years. And they are waiting for someone to do what we cannot." That night, Eli Cain looked up at the frozen fleet for the first time, and 12,000 silent passengers looked back. If you're new to Orbit Cowboy, ride with us, saddle up, and subscribe. Now, let's begin. Marshal Eli Cain was 58 years old, and he had been a frontier marshal for 33 of those years. He had seen colonies die in fire. He had seen them die in plague. He had once, on a moon called Hester's Reach, walked into a settlement of 240 souls who had all, without explanation, walked into the sea on the same Tuesday afternoon. He thought, after Hester's Reach, that nothing in the Outer Rim could surprise him anymore. He was wrong. The Galactic Marshals service had sent him to Kepler-9 because the colony had stopped responding to long-range comms. This was not, in itself, unusual. Outer Rim colonies dropped off the grid all the time. Equipment failures, ion storms, the slow, patient erosion of distance and forgetfulness. The service sent a marshal to check, and the marshal usually came back with a board report and a request for hazard pay. Eli Cain had not requested hazard pay in 19 years. He no longer believed in it. His ship, a battered single-pilot cutter named the Mercy Run, broke atmosphere over Kepler-9 at 1600 local time. On a clear autumn day, Eli ran the standard approach scan. Atmosphere composition, nominal. Surface temperature, nominal. Population reading, 391. The colony was alive. The comms were dead. Eli frowned at his console. He brought the Mercy Run down through the cloud layer, and that was when he first saw it. The fleet. It hung in the sky above the colony like a portrait someone had nailed to the heavens. 47 ships, old colonial-era rescue vessels, the kind that had not been built in 80 years, the kind that had been retired from service before Eli's father had been born. They were arranged in a perfect descent formation, engines angled for landing, cargo doors half open, landing gear extended, and they were not moving. Eli circled the colony twice in slow disbelief. The ships did not move. The shadows beneath them did not shift. The exhaust plumes from their engines hung in the air like sculptures of smoke. He landed the Mercy Run in the colony's empty docking field, set the engines to idle, and stepped down into the dust. The first thing he noticed was the silence. The second thing he noticed was that every face in the colony was already turned toward him. They had been waiting at the edge of the field, 391 residents, men, women, and children, standing perfectly still, watching. And then, slowly, all at once, as if responding to a signal Eli could not hear, every one of them turned their faces upward, toward the frozen fleet, and waited. The colony of Kepler-9 had a single street. It ran from the docking field to a small white wooden chapel at the far end of town, and along it sat 38 buildings, homes, a general store, a smithy, a doctor's office, a one-room schoolhouse with a brass bell mounted above its door. It was the schoolhouse Eli walked toward first. He did not know why. Perhaps because it was the only building with a light still burning in the window. Perhaps because the silence everywhere else felt like a held breath, and he wanted to find a room where someone was breathing. The schoolteacher was an old woman with white hair pulled back into a tight bun and eyes the color of wet slate. She sat at her desk, grading papers with a hand that did not shake even though she had to be at least 80 years old. She looked up when Eli came in. She did not seem surprised. "Marshal," she said, "you're earlier than the last one." Eli stopped just inside the door. "The last one?" She set her pencil down very carefully. "There have been others," she said. "Not many. 3 in 80 years. The first came in 42, the second in 79. The third was 12 years ago. None of them stayed longer than a week." She rose from her desk. She was a small woman, but she moved like someone much younger, like a woman who had been told, a long time ago, that she was not allowed to grow old, and who had simply accepted the terms. "My name is Margaret Weller," she said. "I have been the teacher of this colony since 1944. That makes me, technically, 86 years old. Though I assure you, Marshal, I have not aged a day in 78 of those years. None of us have." Eli looked at her for a long moment. "The fleet," he said. She nodded. "The fleet." She walked past him to the schoolhouse window and gestured up at the sky. The frozen ships hung above the colony like a vast still photograph. Eli could see, through the open cargo doors of the nearest vessel, the silhouettes of figures standing inside. They did not move. They had not moved in 80 years. "They came to rescue us," Margaret Weller said. "In 1946, the colony was failing. Bad harvest, sickness, 3 winters of dust storms. The council sent the Aurelian fleet, 47 ships, 12,000 crew and colonists meant to evacuate us." She paused. "They began their descent at 4:17 in the morning of October 9th, and then time stopped. For them, for us, for everything within 5 kilometers of this colony." She turned and looked at him, and her wet slate eyes were very calm. "We have aged exactly as much as the fleet has descended, Marshal, which is to say, not at all. We eat, we sleep. We teach our children, but we do not grow old. And the children are very strange now." Eli felt something cold settle in his chest. Strange, how? Margaret Weller smiled. It was not a kind smile. "They remember things, Marshal. Things they could not possibly know. Things from up there." She pointed at the frozen fleet. "Things the passengers are thinking." Eli Cain spent the rest of his first day walking the colony. He walked the single street from end to end. 3 times he looked into the windows of houses and saw families sitting at tables, eating meals, mending clothes, reading books. They saw him. They nodded politely. None of them spoke to him. He walked into the general store. The shelves were stocked. The shopkeeper, a thin man with a missing left ear, sold him a tin of dried meat and a bottle of water. The credits Eli paid him went into a drawer that, when the shopkeeper opened it, was already overflowing with credits from 100 other small purchases, none of which had ever been spent. He walked to the chapel at the end of the street. The doors were open. Inside, on every wooden pew, sat a single object: a child's toy, a folded letter, a piece of jewelry, a small wooden horse, a dried flower pressed between 2 pages of a book. Eli counted them. There were 47 objects, 1 on each pew, 1 for each ship. He did not understand what they meant. He did not yet ask. At sunset, though the sun on Kepler-9 did not quite set so much as lean against the horizon and stop, the bell above the schoolhouse began to ring. 391 residents stepped out of their houses at the same moment. They walked to the center of the colony's main square. They formed a slow, silent crowd, and they looked up at the frozen fleet. Eli stood with them. Margaret Weller stood beside him. "What are we doing?" he asked, very quietly. "Apologizing," she said. "For what?" She did not answer. The crowd stood silent for exactly 12 minutes. The children in the front rows counted softly under their breath. When the count reached the right number, every head bowed at once. Then every head lifted. Then, just as quietly, the crowd dispersed back into their homes. The bell rang once more and stopped. Eli stood alone in the square. Margaret Weller had walked back toward the schoolhouse. Above him, the frozen fleet hung silent in the deepening sky. He could see the figures inside the cargo doors more clearly now, he thought, though he could not be sure that one of them was looking directly at him. A small voice spoke at his elbow. "They can see you better at night, mister." Eli looked down. A boy of perhaps 7 stood beside him, barefoot, holding a wooden whistle. The boy was looking up at the fleet with the calm, polite attention of someone who had done this every evening of his life. "Who can see me?" Eli asked. The boy pointed at the second ship from the left. Cargo bay door open. 3 figures visible inside, standing in absolute stillness. "That one's named Captain Isla," the boy said. "She wants to know if you brought her son's letter. She's been waiting for it for a long time." Eli stared at the boy. "Her son's letter?" The boy nodded. "The one her son was supposed to write her. The one he never got to write because she died before he was old enough." The boy looked up at Eli with the matter-of-fact eyes of a child who was not yet old enough to know that what he was saying should be impossible. "She wants to know what he would have said. She's been wondering for 80 years, mister. They all have. That's why they can't land." Eli Cain did not sleep that night. He sat in the Mercy Run with the cockpit lights off and his hands wrapped around a cooling mug of coffee, and he watched the frozen fleet through the windshield. The ships did not move. The colony did not move. Even the wind seemed, somehow, to be moving more slowly here than it should. He thought about the boy with the wooden whistle. He thought about Captain Ela in the second ship from the left. He thought about a son who had grown up without a mother, and a mother who had died not knowing what her son would become, and the 80 years of silence between them that no rescue fleet, no matter how many ships, could ever close. At some point near dawn, he understood what the chapel was. He went to it as the false sun was beginning to lean against the horizon. He pushed open the doors. He walked down the center aisle, between the pews, looking at the 47 objects. A child's toy, a folded letter, a piece of jewelry, a small wooden horse, a dried flower pressed between 2 pages of a book. Each one was an answer. Each one was something the colony had collected over 80 years in the hope of giving it to one of the 12,000 passengers above. A child's toy for a passenger who had died too young to play with it. A folded letter for a passenger whose words had never been written. A wooden horse for a passenger whose grandfather had carved one for him in another life, on another world, and whose grandfather had died before he could give it. The colony had spent 80 years collecting answers for the questions the dead were still asking. And the dead, 12,000 of them, frozen in their final descent, were still listening. Eli sat down on the chapel steps and wept, very quietly for a long time. He had not wept in 26 years. He did not remember the weeping ever stopping. He only remembered, eventually, that he was sitting on the steps and the sky had grown light, and Margaret Weller was sitting beside him, without him having noticed her arrive. "You understand now," she said. Eli nodded. "They cannot land," he said, "because they have not finished. Yes, they are waiting to know how the stories ended. Yes, and the colony, every one of you, has spent 80 years trying to finish the stories for them. Yes." Eli wiped his face with the back of his hand. "And it is not working," he said. Margaret Weller was silent for a moment. No, she said softly, it is not. She turned to look at him. Her wet slate eyes were very tired. We are very small, Marshal. 391 souls, and the dead above us are 12,000. We have given them what we can. Toys, letters, carvings, songs. But we cannot give them what they truly need. We are not enough of them. We never were. She paused. They need someone from outside, someone who carries the world they were trying to reach, someone who can tell them that what they died for, the colonies they were coming to save, the futures they were trying to build, actually happened, that it was worth it, that they did not vanish for nothing. She looked at him. They need you, Marshal. The next chapter goes deep, partner. If this ride's keeping you company tonight, hit that bell. The story Marshal Eli Cain is about to walk into. You don't want to miss what comes next. Eli Cain went back to the schoolhouse that morning. He sat in one of the small wooden chairs meant for children, his knees folded up awkwardly, his coat pulled around him. Margaret Weller sat across from him with a cup of tea that did not steam, in a colony where time had forgotten how to move. Tell me about the others, he said. The 3 marshals before me. Margaret Weller set her cup down. The first was a man named Cordell, she said. He came in 1946, 2 years after the fleet stopped. He was sent because the council wanted to know what had happened. He stayed 3 days. He understood what was being asked of him, and he refused. He said it was not his place. He said the dead should be allowed to die. He left. He filed a report. The council classified it. As far as I know, he lived a long life on a quiet world somewhere and never spoke of us again. Eli nodded slowly. The second, a woman, Marshal Sarah Voss. She came in 1979. She tried. Margaret Weller's face did something complicated, a small, soft, sad thing. She walked into the chapel. She sat with the objects. She tried to tell the dead the stories they wanted to hear. But she did not know the right stories, Marshal. She made them up. She invented endings. She told them their grandchildren had grown up well and their colonies had thrived, and their sacrifices had built a glorious empire. She lied to them, and the dead knew she was lying. They are dead. They are not stupid. What happened? She broke. She stayed 8 days. By the 8th day, she could not look up at the sky anymore. She left in the middle of the night without saying goodbye. We never heard from her again. We do not blame her. It was a great deal to ask. Eli was quiet for a moment. The third? Margaret Weller looked down at her hands. The third was a young man named Marshal Thomas Ari. He came 12 years ago. He understood. He tried to do what we asked. He was honest. He was good. And he died, Marshal, on his 4th day with us. Not from anything we did. His heart simply stopped. He was 31 years old. She looked up. Her eyes were wet. To speak truly to 12,000 listening dead is not a small thing, Marshal. It is the largest thing a man can be asked to do, and not every man's heart is large enough to hold it. Eli sat in the small wooden chair and felt, for the first time in many years, the actual full weight of what he had become, an aging marshal, alone, on the edge of a galaxy that had largely forgotten him, asked now to do something his predecessors had refused, lied through, or died doing. He thought about it for a long time. And if I do it, he said, if I tell them the truth, the actual truth, about what happened to the colonies they were coming to save, about what their sacrifices built and what they didn't, about the futures they wanted that didn't quite come to be, about the children who grew up without them, and the wars that came after, and the long, quiet centuries of forgetting. Will it be enough? Margaret Weller looked at him with great kindness. I do not know, Marshal, she said. No one does, but it is the only thing left to try. She paused. And if it is enough, if you can finish their stories for them, they will land. They will land at last. And we, the colony of Kepler-9, will finally be allowed to grow old and to die, as we should have 80 years ago. Eli Cain spent the next 3 days preparing. He sat in the Mercy Run with his console open and pulled every council historical record he was authorized to access, and a few he was not. He read about the colonies the Aurelian fleet had been built to save. He read about the wars that had come in the decades after the fleet had vanished. He read about the small, stubborn human refusal to disappear that had defined the next 80 years of frontier history. He was looking for the stories, the real stories, the truth, not flattering, not cruel, but accurate. He learned that the colony of Pellen's Hope, which the fleet had been carrying agricultural specialists to save, had failed 2 years after the fleet vanished. Its 300 residents had walked out into the desert and been lost. There was nothing left of it now but a name on an old chart. He learned that the colony of Brennan's Crossing, which the fleet had been carrying medical supplies to save, had survived. It had survived because its residents, told that no help was coming, had improvised a rough vaccine from the local plant life and lost only a third of their population instead of all of it. The descendants of those survivors now numbered nearly 500,000, spread across 4 star systems. He learned that the colony of Halvern's Bend, which the fleet had been carrying a new colony governor to install, had instead, in the absence of any leadership, organized itself into a strange and beautiful experimental commune that had lasted 46 years before quietly dissolving when its founders grew old. The commune had produced no great works. It had produced no famous descendants. It had simply been a place where, for 46 years, a few hundred people had been kind to each other under a hard sky. He learned that the captains and crew of the Aurelian fleet, 12,000 souls, frozen above Kepler-9, had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren still living. He pulled their genealogies. He found names. He found photographs. He found small, ordinary things. A woman who painted murals on grain silos, a man who fixed broken plumbing in a mining town, a child who had won a regional spelling competition the previous spring. He carried all of it with him, on his 4th morning, into the chapel. And in the chapel, at sunrise, he sat down on the floor in front of the altar, and he opened his console, and he began to speak. The colony of Kepler-9 stood in the main square that morning and listened. Eli Cain spoke for 9 hours. He spoke of Pellen's Hope and the families who had been waiting there, and how they had walked into the desert when no help came. He named them where he could find their names. He spoke softly. He did not pretend their fate had been good. He only said, "They waited for you, they believed in you, and when you did not come, they went out to meet whatever was coming next. Together, that is not nothing, that is something." He spoke of Brennan's Crossing, and the rough vaccine, and the third of the population who had been lost, and the 2/3 who had lived. He named the woman who had figured out the vaccine. He spoke of her great-granddaughter, now a doctor in a frontier hospital on a moon 10 systems over. He said, "Your supplies did not arrive, but what you taught them about courage did. They saved themselves, and they remember that you tried." He spoke of Halvern's Bend and the commune of kindness, and the 46 years of small ordinary love. He did not embellish it. He did not make it grander than it had been. He said, "They built no monuments. They left no famous names. They were simply kind to each other for a long time. And in this galaxy, that is rarer than you would think. He spoke of the children, he spoke of the grandchildren, he spoke of the woman who painted murals on grain silos, and the man who fixed plumbing in a mining town, and the child who had won the spelling competition. He read their names aloud, one by one, into the quiet morning air. By the third hour, the children of Kepler-9 had begun to weep. They wept silently, not understanding why, only knowing that the dead above them had begun, very quietly, to listen. By the sixth hour, every adult in the colony was weeping with them. By the ninth hour, Eli Cain's voice was hoarse, and his hands were shaking, and he could not stand up from the floor of the chapel. He had named, in those 9 hours, 411 people. He had told the stories of 17 colonies. He had spoken every truth he had been able to find, the small ones and the large ones, the bitter ones and the beautiful ones, all of them honest. When he was done, the sky above Kepler-9 was very, very still. And then, slowly, so slowly that at first no one was sure they were seeing it, the frozen fleet began to move. The descent took 4 hours. Eli Cain sat on the steps of the chapel and watched it. Margaret Weller sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. The 390 souls of Kepler-9 stood in the main square below, faces turned upward, watching the rescue fleet they had waited for since the morning of October 9th, 80 years ago, finally come down out of the sky. The ships landed in the empty fields outside the colony, 47 of them, in perfect formation, their landing gear settling at last into the dust. The cargo doors opened, the passengers stepped out. 12,000 of them. They were old by then. They had aged in their listening. 80 years of silent attention, 80 years of waiting for someone to finish their stories had marked them. They walked slowly. Many of them held each other. None of them spoke. Captain Ela, of the second ship from the left, walked up to a man in the colony crowd, a man who did not exist on her ship's manifest, a man she had never met, but whose face she knew somehow, the way the dead know things they should not. She handed him a folded piece of paper. On it, in handwriting that was not quite her own and not quite anyone else's, was the letter she had spent 80 years waiting for her unborn son to write to her. The man, who was the great-grandson of her son's son, read it. He wept. He embraced her. They stood together for a long time in the dust. This happened in different forms, 12,000 times. The colony of Kepler-9 was very small. The passengers of the Aurelian fleet were very many. But somehow, through some accounting that no council surveyor could later explain, every passenger found someone, every story found its ending, every question, asked silently for 80 years, was at last answered. When it was over, when the embraces had ended and the last letter had been read and the last grandchild had been named, the passengers of the Aurelian fleet did something Eli Cain had not expected. They did not stay. They walked back to their ships, slowly, calmly, with the soft, contented motion of people who have, at last, finished a very long journey. They boarded. The cargo doors closed. The engines hummed once, gently, almost gratefully, and the 47 ships of the Aurelian fleet lifted off the surface of Kepler-9 and rose, one final time, into the sky. They did not go upward. Not exactly. They went sideways somehow, into a direction Eli Cain could not name, and then they were gone. Margaret Weller, sitting beside him on the chapel steps, took her hand off his arm and folded it into her lap. She closed her eyes. Eli watched the lines of her face, lines that had been frozen at 80 for 78 years, begin, very slowly, to deepen. She was aging. Eli could see it in the colony square below, the school children growing taller in the space of breaths, the young mothers settling into the shapes of grandmothers, the old men who had been frozen at the brink of death, finally, gratefully, beginning to die. By sunset, the colony of Kepler-9 numbered 84. By the next morning, it numbered 9. By the morning after that, only Margaret Weller remained. She found Eli Cain on the chapel steps at dawn. She was very old now. Her hair was white as paper, her hands like dry leaves. She sat down beside him slowly. "Thank you, Marshal," she said. Eli could not answer her. He did not trust his voice. She smiled at him, the smile of a woman who had finally been allowed to grow old after 80 years of being held outside of time. "Tell them," she said. "Tell the next ones, the colonies that come after. Tell them what was here. Tell them we waited well." She closed her eyes. She did not open them again. Marshal Eli Cain buried Margaret Weller in the colony cemetery beside 390 unmarked graves of the residents who had gone before her in those final days. He carved her name into a wooden marker with his own knife. He left Kepler-9 at noon. He did not file a report with the council. He filed something else instead, a manuscript, 400 pages long, in which he wrote down every name of every passenger of the Aurelian fleet, every name of every resident of Kepler-9, and every story he had told in the chapel that long morning when the frozen sky began to move. The manuscript was read, quietly, by a small number of people in the years that followed. But on every frontier colony where it was read, the same small ritual began to spread. At sunset, the bells would ring, the people would step out of their houses, they would stand in silence for 12 minutes, and they would look up at the sky and they would remember, not gods, not empires, not heroes, but simply the long, patient dead who had been trying to reach them, and the ones who had finally arrived. That was The Fleet That Never Landed, the story of Marshal Eli Cain, the colony of Kepler, 9 and 12,000 patient dead who had been waiting 80 years for someone to finish their story. The next one is already loading. Saddle up, subscribe, ring the bell, ride with us every week, and before you go, partner, drop a comment below. If you were the marshal who walked into that chapel, would you have spoken? Or would you, like the first marshal before you, have left the dead to rest unfinished? Until next time, keep your guns clean and your stars closer.